Okay, as Tom said, my name is Gemma Carney, and I've been parachuted in today, and I'm stepping in for Clodagh Harris, who I understand you all know very well. Clodagh and I co-convene the Participatory Democracy Group of the Political Studies Association of Ireland, which is a group for, well, I thought we were the only nerds interested in participatory democracy, but today really makes me realise there's a lot of us out there, and anybody who wants to can join that group. It's the Political Studies Association of Ireland website. So in preparing these public submissions, I suppose there's a couple of things I want to just explain in terms of the approach that Clodagh and I have used. We were full of awe and respect for the people who took the time and trouble to put together sometimes really technical, expert documents done by ordinary citizens. Some people do have a particular professional interest in the area, but a lot of people are have really fallen in love with a particular method of counting votes and have decided to put together a public submission to you, the convention. And this is despite the fact that I was discussing with another colleague recently that actually less than 1% of the Irish population has a PhD. And you wouldn't know that from reading these submissions because the standard was just absolutely awesome. And looking at the panel today, I think you've probably met most of us who have PhDs, particularly the politics people at this stage. So what I'm trying to do today, as somebody who does a lot of qualitative social research now, is to try and share with you what I would call a thematic analysis. So what we did is we went through all of the submissions that were relevant, not all of them, there was 1,422 in total, but the ones that were relevant to today's theme. And what we did is we identified 5 different themes. And that's the structure of the presentation in terms of I'll take you through those. And then I will go into a little, there isn't an awful lot of detail to report on from the Minister for the Environment. So I'll just give you a flavour of that too. So we've tried to really be true to what people have said in the public submissions. But I can't say that we have, absolutely covered every single point because, as I said, some of them were quite technical. But the areas that people, in general, the themes that emerge from these submissions are that people are very interested in the whole area of the electoral system and in terms of how it could be improved. And in relation to that, other issues that arise include separation of powers. So that is the idea that we keep different institutions in a democracy independent of one another. Lots of ideas around direct democracy, which you've already discussed here today, so that citizens actually vote directly on issues as opposed to having representatives do so on their behalf. There was another area that we were going to call electoral administration, but that really makes it sound terribly boring and not important. It's actually about how we count the votes. What are the administrative tools that we use to actually take the preferences of individual citizens and turn them into a decision and that affect our political institutions? And finally, there was another category which we've called innovations, which is suggestions that people made as to how we could do something totally new with the electoral system. So I'll start with electoral systems and then I'll go through each of those other themes. There is a little bit of cynicism about this idea of the convention with some people. This idea that, a lot of what you're doing is symbolic, that it's not really going to change the world. But in fact, what you're doing this weekend is far from that. It's really, really important. And Jason O'Mahony, in his submission, I thought, put it really well. He's a little bit cynical about the whole exercise, but he does say that this weekend is as important as the one on same-sex marriage, because electoral reform is really important because it's making decisions about who actually runs the country. There were a small number of submissions around different very technical submissions around how you would count votes. And one of these, from the De Borda Institute, I think gives the best overview of why this whole area of whether you should have a quota system, a quota border system, a dowdle system, is because an electoral system should do this. An electoral system should be both preferential and proportional, and all preferences cast by the voters should be taken into account. There were lots of ideas of how we could move away from PRS-TV And many submissions were suggesting that we adopt a PR list system. And I think Jason Fitzharris does a very good job in his submission of explaining why it's important. List PR encourages parties to run candidates from diverse backgrounds. Because parties can run more candidates, they can select candidates, which ordinarily they would not have selected under STB, because their electoral base was unknown and it was too risky to chance it. And some of this, you probably noticed, is quite similar to what came up from your plenary. So I hope that's good that it's reflecting back, that it's endorsing the discussion you're having, rather than boring you rigid and being repetitive. So another area of the electoral system was that people suggested was to have mixed member systems. And the National Women's Council of Ireland said that they would like to see either a version of the current system, which includes bigger constituencies, or a PRSTV list with large multi-seat constituencies as well as a national list. So that's a flavour of what the submission said in terms of electoral systems. So what did they say about separation of powers? Well, there were some suggestions that are worth referring to that wouldn't actually require constitutional reform. So we could reduce the size of the cabinet to 7. Others suggested that it could appoint 2 members of the cabinet from the Seanad. Those were both suggestions from O'Brolcoin's submission. And then there's another area which has come up already in the discussion here today, which is this idea of ministers from outside the Dáil and Seanad. And some people argue really passionately that ministers should not be TDs. Jason O'Malley, again, in his submission says, ministers should not be TDs. I know this sounds mad, but letting people be both means that we get a parliament that does not do its job because the government TDs want to be ministers, and ministers worry more about their constituencies than national problems. Why can't ministers be appointed and answerable to the Dáil? So now we move on to direct democracy. And you've had some discussion about this today. To me, personally, I find this a very exciting area, but I'm seeing that it is fraught with difficulty too. But Jonathan Victory, in his submission, gave quite a nice summation of why it is worth looking at. Direct democracy is a constitutional provision that allows citizens to initiate referendums once a certain proportion of them have signed a petition. Issues for consideration that came up across a number of submissions when it comes to direct democracy include the number of signatures needed, regulation of campaign finance, what kind of voting system could be used, the cooling off period, geographical spread. Some of these things you've discussed yourselves today. And now the next section, next theme that we identified from the public submissions is the one around how we count the votes. This is the bit, of course, the most exciting, isn't it, on election night? But it's also the bit that is still a little obscure. And Liam Weeks, who is one of those, who is an expert in this area, but made a public submission, he refers back and quotes Jack Lynch to really articulate the problem with the system that we have. And Jack Lynch says, the defects of the present system have often been pointed out, that the preferences for only some candidates are counted. The complicated and arbitrary method of counting and transferring votes introduces a random element into the process, and the ultimate result may be far from what the electorate really intended. So there's lots of other issues to consider in terms of how we count the votes. And some of these will come up when we talk about the report from the Department of the Environment. And something that you've mentioned already today is the idea of having an independent electoral commission. So that comes up in the public submissions too, that we should abolish by-elections. Perhaps we need to introduce electronic voting, permit early voting, have a central register of electors linked to PPS numbers, or to randomly rotate the order of candidates' names on the ballot paper. There were lots of different views on the abolition of by-elections that are really worth looking at if you want to go and look at the submissions in more detail. And finally, the theme that I've identified is innovations, which is really where people are suggesting some new addition or some potentially interesting improvement for the whole system. And one of these is to extend the franchise to Irish citizens living abroad, which I suppose at the moment has a lot of resonance with the emigration being on the rise, to have term limits, to strengthen local government and to reduce the number of TDs. And it's worth quoting Lekela. This is an Irish network from the northeast of England. And you can sense the kind of frustration with people who've obviously spent most of their lives quite close to Ireland, but not being able to exercise their Irish citizenship. And they say, the recognition of universal human rights and democratic rights in a modern democracy leads inexorably to the conclusion that all Irish citizens who have a continuing link with their native land, regardless of their current domicile, must be included in the body politic and must, therefore, be granted voting rights not only in presidential elections, but also in general and European elections and in national referenda. So that concludes what I'm going to say about the public submissions. Obviously, in less than 3 hours, I couldn't have covered it all. But I hope what I've done is given you a flavour of what the people who have taken the time to put together a public submission and make it to you, what they feel is perhaps the most important thing for them in terms of your decision making. So now I'll go on to the report of the Environment, Heritage and Local Government. As Tom said, this covered 4 areas: establishment of an electoral commission, measures to improve voter turnout, difficulties with the electoral register and electronic voting. Now, I'm just literally going to show you what these said, and I'm not going to pass comment on it, but you've probably looked at the information note anyway. So on the Electoral Commission, this is the one that's most active, let's say, and informative. And here the information note tells us about how there's been legislation enacted in 2011 and 2012, and that this strengthens the political funding regime and makes parties have at least 30% women and 30% men candidates at general elections. And that response concludes by confirming the Electoral Amendment Act 2013 was signed in March and provides for 158 TDs to be elected in 40 constituencies. The rest of it is a little bit less active. On voter turnout, this question is not really under the department's scrutiny at the moment. It's not to say that it's not a concern, but levels of voter turnout differ from poll to poll, elections and referendums, and from year to year. The response on the electoral register is quite similar. The electoral register is not at present the subject of detailed scrutiny in the department. Responsibility for the electoral register lies with the voting public, local authorities and the department. The department is responsible under the Minister for policy issues relating to the electoral system generally and for bringing forward legislative proposals as appropriate for consideration by the Oireachtas. And there's a similar vein to the final electronic voting one, which is that it's not the subject of detailed scrutiny. The electronic voting project undertaken by previous administrations was brought to finality in 2012 with the disposal of equipment and the ending of storage arrangements for that equipment. And the note was appended by a press release from the Minister's Department about that issue. So, in summary, to go back to the public submissions, I think it's safe to say from our thematic analysis that electoral systems, the people who wrote these submissions really believe that electoral systems matter. That there are options other than the status quo and that these should be considered. That direct democracy deserves serious attention, but that responsibility for electoral administration or how the votes are counted, that still remains unclear. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to read all those submissions. And I wish you every luck with your deliberations.
Thank you very much. That's a very useful summary, I think, of the many submissions that came in. We have some time for comments. Katrina.
I'm just wondering, I don't know who I'm directing this to, but in the case of citizens' initiative, because I think the direct democracies has a lot of potential, and I agree with you in terms of the innovation, but I wonder, could somebody, the person who probably knows the most about it there, comment on how do you protect, one, safeguarded from violation of fundamental freedoms and human rights, and secondly, lobby groups that are very, very well resourced, how they can have a disproportionate impact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Yeah, Joan, please. Could we have it here, please?
Thank you. It's Joan Stewart. I just want to make a comment that the government aren't currently taking any measures to improve voter turnout. And I feel that we really need to do something about this. We need to make it easier for people to vote and to encourage people to vote. And maybe ask the convention, if other people feel the same way or feel that strongly about it, that maybe it should go into the report as a recommendation from us.
Do you have any specific ideas, Joan, about that?
Well, one idea I would have would be more widely available postal vote. Mm-hmm. Like, say, if a student is away studying, even if it is a weekend, it costs money to come home to vote. And, it's not that easy. So if they had a postal vote more widely available, I think more people would vote.
Okay, fine.
So just one idea.
Thanks very much indeed. Aon, please. James. Okay.
Thanks, Chair. I just have to say I'm pretty underwhelmed by the department's submission. In 3 of the 4 topics, they say that not at present the subject of detailed scrutiny in the department. I'm pretty unimpressed by that. But anyway, just on the issue of voter turnout, I think that's really crucial to everything we're discussing here, because I know I've made this point before, but I want to make it again. And the issue of compulsory voting has been mentioned, and that mightn't be the solution that people are comfortable with. But the fact is that, poorer, more disadvantaged, more disconnected minority groups don't have the same voter power and therefore don't have the same power in Irish society. And we have to investigate that and find mechanisms, because that has a real impact on the most vulnerable and the most disconnected in Irish society. You know that from voter turnout in poorer areas versus richer areas, younger people versus older people. And that has to be really at the core of what we discuss here. Thanks.
Thank you. And indeed, you've made that point as well at another of our meetings. James, please.
Thanks. I hope to get my point at this particular juncture in the debate. But as I see it, the electoral register up and down the country is flawed. And I mean, the bedrock of any good system, electoral system, is the electoral register. And it's woefully neglected within the local authorities, from the rate collectors' jobs were done away with in the local authorities. Those were the people that were responsible for maintaining a register. Each year there's a lot of expense put into preparing a register, and the people who are involved are not experienced in the whole issue of non-nationals, indeed citizenship and that. And I mean, in the 2009 local and European elections, there was something in the region of 800,000 errors in the electoral register, and I think there is a great need for change here in this area, and you need responsibility for the maintenance of a rolling register to be the responsibility of an electoral commission. And I'm disappointed with the department's response that hasn't given more time and thought to this particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I know Michael Marsh is going to be dealing with the issue of the Electoral Commission when he speaks in a few moments. Susan, please.
Thank you. One of the things we said in relation to the improving turnout was maybe to have elections over 2 days, a Friday and a Saturday, for those people who are travelling, for students and so on. There was a very interesting comment, and forgive me, I couldn't catch all of it, from Jason Fitzharris in relation to the lists. And he talked about, parties selecting people from more diverse backgrounds. This was in the summary that you just gave us. And I thought that was really interesting. We hadn't actually touched on that, I didn't think, this morning when we talked about lists and list systems. That point was never raised, and suddenly I thought, Lord, have we missed something altogether in relation to the list? Because we were talking about the dual systems and the rows that occur between politicians about who should be on the list or whatever. And that seemed to me to be quite a fundamental point, or else I've misconstrued it. But I just wondered if perhaps somebody expert in the area of lists might be able to comment, or you might be able to draw that back up. I think it was perhaps the second comment that was made by Jason Fitzharris. Thank you.
Gemma, would you like to comment?
Well, this is what I think. I think when you're getting, to the I can imagine by the end of a weekend like this that you must be becoming befuddled. I mean, I have a PhD in political science, and I'm struggling to keep up with a lot of what you're discussing. And you're trying to make a lot of decisions about quite technical things all at once. And I think, certainly for me, what the public submissions did was that they showed you the application. You know, the people had said, this is what happens if you do this. So something about the PR list system, that's such a good point that he's making, because what it means is that, you know, if you have a list, then there's a little bit less risk for a party because they can put down lots of different types of people, and then if you vote, Michael will give you more detail on exactly how it works, but it means that it gives them a bit more freedom than just having to have one candidate. Michael will explain in more detail.
Well, I think we'll go on to Michael very shortly, but just of the comments that were made, Katrina's comment there about if you're in a so-called direct democracy, protection against, if you like, capture of some of that. Michael, would either of you like to comment?
Yes, well, in some countries, that's certainly a concern that you might get majorities voting for something which basically override minority rights, and we can imagine if the initiative had been available in Northern Ireland under the Stormont regime, for example, what might have happened. So in some countries, or in any country, what could happen is that voters might launch an initiative against a tax and strike down the tax, but still want the spending that the government had predicated against that tax. So in some countries, what happens is that there's some screening bodies, such as a constitutional court, or maybe it would be the Supreme Court in this country, and certain issues maybe that would be that would conflict with the Constitution as it stands, or maybe would affect the money supply, are not allowed to be put by the people. Or alternatively, there can be a post hoc scrutiny of them, and even if, and this happens in some American states, even if the people vote for something, it might subsequently be struck down by the courts because it violates the Constitution. But there are those kind of complexities with direct democracy. And also the other question you raised there about lobbies, well, this certainly happens in the USA, where California was mentioned earlier, where a number of voters can initiate a referendum, and that might seem to empower grassroots people, but what's happened is that a whole industry has grown up around that. There are companies that specialize in signature gathering. So if 100,000 signatures are needed, so for example, the Parliament in California legislature might pass a bill that regulates dentists, that lays down regulations for dentists. The Californian Dental Association doesn't like it, so they hire a signature gathering company to go out and gather 100,000 signatures to launch a petition against this. The lobby actually has to pay the company to do this, and the company might pay voters $10 or so to sign up, and then it's put to the people, and well-resourced lobbies can and there's evidence of this happening, swing public opinion. Very often public opinion is initially well disposed towards this proposal, but once the relevant interest group gets going in a big way, opinion switches. So critics of the whole initiative idea in the USA, especially in the southwestern states, is that it doesn't necessarily empower ordinary people in the way that in theory it does, but actually it panders to lobbies and allows them to get around attempts by parliaments to regulate their activities.